Hello, welcome to your next episode of Bold and Blunt. And I'm your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you the Christian conservative view of today's news and events. So today we're going to talk about something that has been talked about for some time in the media, but maybe you don't know what it is. Contact tracing. Maybe you've heard the term, maybe you've heard it talked about by researchers and doctors, politicians, but you don't know what it means. So we have been hearing a lot about contact tracing in recent weeks. We've been told that in order to get back to some kind of normal in America, in order to venture out of our homes and get back to work, put the whole coronavirus thing behind us, that one of the things we're going to have to do here in America is contact tracing. It'll be the new normal, we're told, like wearing face masks. Contact tracing will be America's new normal. At least that's what we're told. So I want to tell you, take care. Take care here about embracing this program. Like face masks, contact tracing really ought to be fought. It really ought to be challenged. And I'm going to tell you why. There are some serious privacy concerns you should have about contact tracing. Some serious government and big tech surveillance issues you need to be aware of before you volunteer, and that's volunteer in air quotes, to participate in this. And that's the first red flag, why I say volunteer in air quotes, because it's in my humble opinion that America's rapidly headed down a path where government won't be asking nicely for citizens to contact trace, but outright requiring contact tracing as a condition of travel, of employment, of entering places of business, of entering places of worship, of entering public buildings, of using public transportation, of doing anything and everything that just a few short months ago, before COVID-19 came onto the scene, everything Americans were regularly doing, freely doing, without even thinking. So let's look at what contact tracing is. And to start, let me give you the official government definition of what contact tracing is, which, of course, is going to sound very sensible, very sane, and very, very non-threatening when it comes to violating your civil individual rights. So from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention website is this, and this is a quote. Contact tracing is a core disease control measure employed by local and state health department personnel for decades, end quote. It's been going on for decades, we're told. CDC also goes on to say, and this is again a quote, a key strategy for preventing further spread of COVID-19 is contact tracing. Okay, so CDC also goes on to say that contact tracing, because of the dangers of COVID-19, must be immediately ramped up nationwide, coming to a community near you. Then the CDC goes on to define the core principles of contact tracing, the principles that must always be part and parcel of any successfully run contact tracing program. And it may be a bit dry, but I'm going to quote from the CDC website so you can see how friendly it all sounds. You can see the language that the government is using to push this. Quote from CDC, contact tracing is part of the process of supporting patients with suspected or confirmed infection. Isn't that nice? The CDC is supporting patients. 2, contact tracing. Public health staff work with a patient to help them recall everyone with whom they have had close contact during the time frame while they might have been infectious. So government officials are going to work with the patient. They're going to nicely nudge the patient along to help that patient name names about who they've contacted, who they've come in contact with over the weeks or days or however long the coronavirus has been in their system. Again, friendly and helpful. That's the name of the government's game. All right, back to the CDC's website. Another core principle of contact tracing. Public health staff warn those exposed individuals of their potential exposure as rapidly and as sensitively as possible. CDC then protects patient privacy. Contacts are only informed that they may have been exposed to a patient with the infection. They are not told the identity of the patient who may have exposed them. In other words, so the government can tell you, hey, we have information that leads us to believe that you have been exposed to the coronavirus. And you say, really? Who did I come in contact with? And the government says, oh, that's private. We can't tell you. So what the government is saying is basically, trust me, trust me. Another core principle from the CDC's website about contact tracing. Contacts, this is a quote, are provided with education, information, and support to understand their risk, what they should do to separate themselves from others who are not exposed, monitor themselves for illness, and the possibility that they could spread the infection to others, even if they themselves do not feel ill, end quote. That's the government's way of ratcheting up the fear and making you feel guilty if you don't take the precautions that they recommend you take. But it's voluntary. Here's the last CDC principle, core principle for contact tracing. And again, I quote, contacts are encouraged to stay home, maintain social distance from others, at least 6 feet, until 14 days after their last exposure. In case they also become ill, they should monitor themselves by checking their temperature twice daily and watching for cough, shortness of breath. To the extent possible, public health staff should check in with contacts to make sure they are self-monitoring and have not developed symptoms. Contacts who develop symptoms should promptly isolate themselves and notify public health staff. They should be promptly evaluated for infection and for the need for medical care, end quote. And if that one core principle doesn't terrify you, I don't know what should. Let's just parse through that language for a second. What that core principle states is that if government deems you came into contact with someone who has the coronavirus, that you should isolate, you should quarantine yourself, and that the government should have oversight of how you were going about that quarantine period, that 14-day quarantine period. You get that, right? That's what that language means. And it's all so very friendly and helpful sounding, right? The CDC would have it believed that COVID-19 is a contagious disease, so health officials, well, they just want to take information from those who've been infected and jot down all the places they've been, all the people they've been into contact with, so they can inform those poor, unsuspecting people who have crossed paths with the infected COVID-19 patients and alert them. Warn them, hey, you might want to get tested as well. And so to do that, the CDC is just asking for volunteers for the contact tracing program. Participate. Watch out for your neighbors. Do the right thing. Don't be selfish. That's what we are supposed to believe. That's how the CDC and all the government health bureaucrats want contact tracing to be presented. Well, no. First off, you have to understand that when the government is involved with asking citizens for information, it's hardly ever a request. It's only a request. It's only voluntary until you say no. It's only a request, and it's only nicely posed as a request until you start to ask questions like, why do you need this information? What are you going to do with this information? Who are you going to share this information with? Then things become a little bit more tense. And secondly, with contact tracing, and this is where the bigger threat to individual freedoms comes in, technology is going to be a big player. It's not the pencil and paper version where they ask questions and they simply jot down your answers. Even the CDC acknowledges this. In a headline on its contact tracing website, the CDC says, quote, data management and technology will be needed. It will be needed to go forward with contact tracing successfully. So, how does that work? How does contact tracing using technology work? And this is where the big chill comes in. This is where the big chill should be running down your back as you think of America's freedoms and the state of America's Constitution. Apple and Google happen to have right now a handy-dandy app that you can download on your smartphone. And governments want these apps to track you, okay? The idea is if someone has coronavirus and you have crossed their path, then your app will let you know. Just as if you have coronavirus and you cross someone else's path, their app will let them know. Right now, the app's set so users have to input whether or not they have COVID-19. And it's also set so they have to opt in to report information to government or not. But here's the big warning. You have to look down the road. You have to look where this technology can lead. Business may be doing this, but government may actually want something different. And here, the groundwork's being laid for big government surveillance and tracking. Google, Apple may resist right now. Users may opt out right now. But think of the pressure from government health officials. They're going to say it's for the public good. It's for the public's health to have access to this data. It's the patriotic thing to do, to give up that data to help your fellow citizen. 3 million Australians downloaded this technology. It's called the COVID Safe app, by the way. 3 million Australians downloaded the COVID Safe app onto their smartphones within the first 3 days of the app's public offering. Coming to America? Already has. It's here. In late April, a poll reported by the Washington Post found that roughly 3 in 5 of all Americans said they wouldn't download this app. And of the 82% of Americans who actually own smartphones, 50% of those said they wouldn't use this app. That means a good portion of Americans would. But why would you? Think about it. Why would you trust Apple or Google or the untold number of unknown government bureaucrats working with Apple and Google? Maybe not now, but eventually. Why would you trust these people with your personal and private health information? Why would you allow big tech, big government to track all your movements and all your interactions with other people at all? Even for a supposed health crisis like COVID-19. That's just crazy. You don't know where that data will go. You don't know who will have access to that data. You don't know how that data will be used in the future. You don't know how that app would morph and be used in the future. Imagine police getting their hands on such surveillance capabilities legally. And mark these words, they will. Because if we Americans are willing to allow government and tech companies to track our every movement for a virus, well, you know what? You better believe we Americans will be just as willing to let police track our movements for security and safety. It's for the safety of Americans, don't you know? The possibilities here are endless for government, for big tech, for law enforcement, police, for government, endless possibilities for government. And here's the thing to worry about. You may not have the ability to say no to contact tracing for very long. That voluntary participation may soon enough become a condition for doing business, a condition for just going about your regular American business. There is a bill in Congress being pushed right now by Congressman Bobby Rush, a Democrat from Illinois, and dozens of his Democratic colleague co-sponsors that would allocate $100 billion taxpayer dollars to implement contact tracing on a nationwide basis. The money would be used to hire, train, and equip contact tracing officials in local communities. Listen to the very language of the legislation, which is numbered, by the way, get this, H.R. 6666. H.R. 6666. This bill authorizes, here's the quote, the Secretary of Health and Human Services to award grants to eligible entities to conduct diagnostic testing for COVID-19 and related activities, such as contact tracing, through mobile health units and as necessary at individuals' residences and for other purposes at individuals' homes, knocking on your doors. Other purposes? What's that? Well, according to the bill, that's defined as helping individuals quarantine themselves. How very friendly and helpful of our government, helping us to stay inside our very own homes.
The 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Right? Ronald Reagan, he had that right. And when it comes to contact tracing, we should remember that.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Johns Hopkins University is here to help too. You know, Johns Hopkins, that group of medical experts at the heart of reporting and mapping all those COVID-19 numbers, the wildly skewed, wildly flawed, computer-modeled based coronavirus numbers. Well, Johns Hopkins released an online training course for people who want to actually get hired by the government as contact tracers.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
Keep that in mind. And think of this, hat tip to Eagle Forum for pulling this quote from one section of Johns Hopkins COVID-19 contact training course. This is from the video. This is from the training video. And the quote is kind of like a teacher speaking to a student, okay? So this is the quote. Next, let's talk about autonomy. Autonomy legally means the right of a person to make their own decisions. This is true unless the decisions they make or the things they do can harm someone else. And we all know that this is true. And in the case of contact tracing, it means that people can make their own decisions, but if they're not isolating themselves or not quarantining themselves, that could harm someone else. It does put other people at risk. So they do have some limits on their autonomy or their ability to make their own decisions within the context of contact tracing. End quote. See where this leads? Let's reel that back. The training for contact tracers being put forth by Johns Hopkins University is this. Yes, participation is voluntary. Yes, individuals can make their own choices or not, but the choice individuals must make is to participate in contact tracing because if they don't, that means these individuals are potentially harming others, and that means, obviously, they're not mentally or emotionally fit enough to make their own choices. Abide what the government says, abide what the government's health bureaucrats advise, or you're deemed unfit mentally or emotionally, and therefore incapable of making your own decisions. My gosh. This is the language of the communists. This is propaganda in its vilest form. This is the rhetoric of collectivists. And guess what? Some communities around our nation right now are already starting with these types of contact tracing programs as conditions of resuming normal, well, the new normal of business and activity. I'm telling you, beware. Beware the contact tracing.
I'm from the government and I'm here to help.
It's hair-raising. It's un-American. It's unconstitutional. It's big government surveillance. It's big tech power. If what I've told you about contact tracing isn't eye-opening enough, I actually have a guest today who's going to talk more about the technological aspects of the program and give you an idea of how secure this data collection really is, because we all know that when we talk about electronic data, we're talking about potential for hacking, potential for data theft. So my guest's name is Quentin Rhoads-Herrera. He's the director of professional services at the cybersecurity company Critical Start, based in Texas, but doing business nationwide. And he's got loads of experience in the field of information technology with an emphasis on determining threat and vulnerability, of determining how safe and secure technology systems really are. So, Quentin, thanks so much for being here on Bold and Blunt.
No worries.
So, what do you know about contact tracing?
So I know contact tracing is the concept of being able to track individuals who may have come into contact with an individual who has tested positive for COVID-19 or other pandemics or epidemics in the past.
Right. And when you add technology into contact tracing, how does that change how they used to do it? Because it used to be just a, pencil and paper type of deal where they would ask you for voluntary information. Now they want to use technology. The government does. How would that work?
So technology is being leveraged in multiple different ways, and actually some states are still using the manual method in addition to technology, so they still have individuals going and talking to people and finding out who has been in contact with people who tested positive. The technology aspect of it is widely varying in the United States and across the world. Some are using GPS, some are using Bluetooth, low energy, some are using QR codes. Even the storage is different. Some are being having all the data stored in one location versus decentralized storage where the data of individuals are stored on the person's own device.
Okay, now I'm sure you're aware that Google, Apple just released their app, the COVID Safe app. Can you kind of walk people through how this would work? I guess you would, download the app on your smartphone, and what happens?
So Google and Apple partnered to make what we call an API, so an ability for the health authorities to make an application to interact with Google and Apple's infrastructure effectively. What happens is if I come in within 5 feet of another individual who has decided to opt into the Google and Apple way of doing contact tracing, and if I'm there for longer than, let's say, 5 minutes, we exchange unique keys based off of Bluetooth low energy.
The smartphone, the app does that on its own. The app automatically does that?
So that's actually the API that Google and Apple wrote. So the application you get from the health authority does nothing except for allow you as the user to upload the fact that, hey, I've been tested positive and here's my unique number off of my positive test paperwork. The applications don't track the individuals. The API that Google and Apple wrote does. And they're only tracking based off of distance, time within that time between you being next to someone, as well as giving you the ability to opt in and opt out. And they randomize your unique number ever so often just to ensure extra level of privacy.
So in layman's terms, though, there has the tracking is of your location. So if you're carrying a smartphone and you have the app enabled on your smartphone, then it would have to track your location as an individual.
So it doesn't track location. It uses Bluetooth, which doesn't store longitude or latitude. What it does is it just allows Bluetooth broadcasts a unique identifier. Every Bluetooth does. If you ever look and start searching for other Bluetooth devices on your phone because you're trying to pair to one of your devices, you'll see a bunch of ones that you don't own also showing up on the list of things that you can pair with. The reason that is because every Bluetooth device broadcasts their unique name. And so what Google and Apple did was they took that concept and they said, if I'm within 5 feet of an individual and I'm there for a long enough time, I'm going to take that unique name. I'm going to randomize your key, your unique name into some random key, and I'm going to send that to the other individual, and they're going to store it for roughly 14 days. And if I test positive, I then can go through the health authority's application and say, I've tested positive, here's proof. And then the health authority, using the API that Google and Apple wrote, can notify everybody. And if someone has my unique key, would be notified, hey, you came into contact with somebody who has tested positive. It doesn't track exact locations. I mean, you can probably narrow it down if you have enough data sets of these unique keys, but it's a decentralized storage, meaning everybody has their own set of keys. They're not sending everybody's keys to a server so that somebody can have all of that data.
Okay, so there's no database being built that details where a certain person is at a certain time and whether that person tests positive for the coronavirus or not. That's what you're saying?
So there's a database for that, but that's managed by the health authority that developed the application. There's no database of everybody's unique identifiers if they've never uploaded it to their health authority. So you can use Google and Apple's API without any application when they release the second round of their second phase of the development. The second phase of the development is going to allow you as the end user to opt in to see if you've been around somebody, but you don't have to download any application from the health authority. And you don't have to upload anything saying that you've tested positive, which does impact the viability of this product, of this method.
Okay. It was the opt-in stuff that I found concerning, because I was wondering if people, first off, would be aware that it's an opt-in. And second off, if, a lot of people have smartphones and they know how to install apps, but they don't know all the, they don't know all the ins and outs of the permissions that go with the app. So the potential for privacy invasions, for citizens to be concerned that they're being surveilled and so forth, what do you see happening with that? Where do you stand on that?
So I think, if we look at just the Google and Apple method, they've been very upfront with how they've developed this, their API, how it tracks you, what methods they're using to protect your privacy and security. They're also holding health authorities to the same standards and security as any application that's submitted to them. So there is a level of transparency. The other methods that are being developed, there's a lack of transparency I'm seeing, like states who've developed their own application, or even countries. They're not being very transparent into how they're tracking you, what data they're collecting. And unless you're very technologically savvy to find out yourself, you're not going to know. So there's this lack of trust that you may have with the government or with a private organization. So I think for me personally, the more transparent a company is, or the government is, in what they're implementing on people's phones and asking you to opt in, the better chance you have for participation.
As I understand it, Google, Apple, they're being resistant to some of government's requests for more ability to obtain what private citizens might consider intrusive data. Do you see the pressure reaching a point where the Google or Apple app becomes something that's more location-driven? And I'm speaking to specifically the COVID Safe app.
Yeah, no, I don't believe so. And what you're talking about is really like France. France asked, and Apple said no. Google asked if they could centralize, or Germany asked if they can centralize the data, and Apple said no.
Yep.
We've seen in the past that Apple has turned down federal subpoenas and hired a bunch of lawyers and said, "Come after me." Really, at the end of the day, Google and Apple's brand and reputation is at stake here. If something happens with their app, or they falter in some way in allowing a government to have their way, which then ends up in the leakage of people's private data, it's going to negatively impact these two brands significantly. And Apple has a brand of not following any instructions from the government and wanting to put the user's privacy in front of everyone else's, and Google has to a point. So I don't think they would ever falter. I think what happens is what we see in England, where they wouldn't budge. And so England decided that they were going to go their own route, which has raised a lot of concerns for me and a lot of my peers, because they have stated that they're going to store the data even after the COVID-19 pandemic is over. They haven't stipulated how long they're going to store it. The application really isn't, they haven't talked about how the application is truly being developed. They've briefly mentioned how it's tracking data, but I mean, until somebody who's technologically savvy decompiles it and finds out for themselves, the vast majority of people in England are not going to really know.
See, that's the problem here, in my view, that you may trust Apple, but government, the same data that Apple collects, or worse, in the hands of government, is where the breakdown in trust occurs, because you can't predict who would have access to the data, what they would use the data for, and how these programs might expand. Instead of becoming a health issue that we're concerned about, suddenly it's in the hands of law enforcement, and it's a security and safety issue for the community. Could you kind of break down the threats regarding that, the expansion of this technology, and the surveillance, the tracking that could result?
So, yes, governments can decide to expand and say, we want to go this other route instead of Google and Apple, and this other route's more invasive of people. And what we see, strangely, though, is that people during times of crisis trust governments more than they do private organizations, especially now after issues like Cambridge Analytica and a few others. So it could, expand to being mass surveillance. We saw that in South Korea, where their COVID-19 tracking app effectively was tracking the exact longitude and latitude GPS location of their citizens. So it could become mass surveillance. And that's really when citizens need to start questioning the government in what is being installed, why is it being installed, what are you collecting, et cetera. I mean, most of it should be health data, and so you as a citizen have the ability to request your own health data due to HIPAA, and the government is stipulated to protect data under health category under the HIPAA regulations. So, I would expect, if this does ever expand and they do move away from a program that's been transparent, the people need to ask more questions. However, outside of that, we do see security issues with the technology being used. Just in the last few months, we've actually seen Bluetooth and Bluetooth Low Energy have severe vulnerabilities that can lead to the exploitation of people's phones. In fact, one of them had the recommendation of not broadcasting on your Bluetooth, which then defeats the entire purpose of using Bluetooth or using contact tracing via Bluetooth, because you have to broadcast. So there's not only a risk of the federal government expanding into something more surveillance or collecting too much data for no reason. We also have to be worried about the technology being used to track, because that technology could have flaws that end up exposing individuals' phones to malicious actors.
Well, anytime you speak about technology, and I know this is your area of expertise here, you're talking about vulnerabilities. You're talking about potential for hacking, potential for data theft, and so forth. So this is very real when we're talking about contact tracing, using technology to contact trace. Is that correct?
Yes, 100%. It's a very real issue that we need to address. We're at a point, though, if you look at the states that are doing the manual method, New York, New Jersey, and a few others, their volume is going to be massive, and the funding to conduct contact tracing at that volume is going to be astronomical during a time where our economy is already depressed. And so that's where technology kind of steps in and helps alleviate the issue with volume, and it helps speed up. We just have to, if we're going to go this route, we have to ask the right questions and ensure that the technology we're using is thoroughly tested and vetted for privacy and security by unbiased individuals. And in this case, the unbiased individuals are the citizens of the United States or whatever country, not the government or corporations that made it.
I got to say, Quentin, it kind of sounds like we're all screwed, that sooner or later, as we move toward this technology, it's not going to assuredly be held only in the hands of people who are unbiased and who are trustworthy. It's just going to grow and expand.
It's possible. I mean, we saw that with games on phones, right? Eventually, when they first started, way back in the day, right? When you played Snake on your phone, all it did was just little pixels on your phone, and that was it. Now we're at a day and age where some games track your exact location. They collect what you like, what you don't like. They track what you searched. We saw Facebook added some capability in their mobile apps to track exactly what you're doing outside of the application. So yes, 100%. There's always a risk of apps being used beyond their purpose and design for reasons such as capitalism or violence in some cases of countries. So with contact tracing applications or anything like this that's dealing with health, people need to make the informed decision. Do they trust the entity that developed the application, which is the health authority, and do they trust the company that made the API, or do they trust the nonprofit university or the research area of the university who developed the QR coding in California? Do they trust these enough to put their privacy at risk?
And so, just last question, what would be your answer? What would be your best advice to citizens for that?
So I'm not going to participate. I think my privacy is like you said, there's too many unknowns in this situation, and there's too many different implementations of contact tracing for me to trust one over the other. And I'm kind of sitting back and waiting to see how this really plays out over the next few months.
Well, I am with you on that, Quentin. Quentin Rhoads-Herrera, I really appreciate your time. And is there a website or social media that people can find you at?
Yeah, so you can find me on Twitter at Paragon SEC, or obviously our company's website, criticalstart.com/Team Aries is our team it's our offensive and defensive security research team.
Thank you, Quentin.
No worries. Thank you very much.
So that's Bold and Blunt for this week, and I hope you have a better understanding of what contact tracing is and what it isn't. So when government comes knocking, you might have some questions that you want answered, or as Quentin himself, the expert with this, says, you might want to opt out completely. Either way, thanks for listening. Appreciate your time. Have a great week, and in the meanwhile, stay bold.